Brian, one of the so-called proofs of God is the ontological argument, where it is on a pure reason basis, arguing from God's perfection to God's necessary existence. Virtually all philosophers today think this is interesting, it's fun, it makes you think about meanings of language, but almost nobody thinks that it's really a proof of God. But you do?
Um, I th- I'm not sure there's any such thing as proof in philosophy, but I think it's a stronger argument than many people believe.
Tell me why.
Okay, the version I like has just three premises. One is the claim that if God existed, he would exist necessarily. And that's something that actually, with the exception of Richard Swinburne, just about everybody who thinks about it agrees with. The second is a principle of logic that nobody doubts. And the third is the claim that possibly God exists. Given those three premises, nobody disputes that you get the conclusion that God exists.
So let's go through each one of those again. Start with premise one, that if God exists, God necessarily exists.
Right.
I hate to say this, but I sort of agree with Swinburne in the sense that I can imagine a world in which God didn't exist. So it doesn't seem like there's a logical necessity that God exists.
I'm not sure you can imagine a world in which God doesn't exist. And the reason is this. How does the imagination work? Well, it presents kind of mental pictures of things. You can't picture God being present, nor can you picture God being absent. He's not the sort of being whose existence or non-existence would make a sensory difference to the world. So imagination isn't the right faculty to sort of invoke there.
Okay, but I think if you're forcing me into that route, then I can almost say nothing about God. If you're limiting my ability to analyze whether God is necessary or not by imagination, then I can't say anything about God. I just go into a hole.
Well, if you can't do it, if you can't think about the possibility of God by way of about the possibility of God not existing by way of imagination, you can do it by way of reasoning. You can ask yourself, is there a self-consistent supposition in the claim that God doesn't exist? Does that really make sense at a deep level? And that very much depends on what your idea of God is to begin with. My idea of God is that God is, among other things, the being that stands behind all necessary truth, like mathematics and logic and so on. If that's the right idea, and I've argued that it is, then for God not to exist would be the same thing as for mathematics not to be true and for logic not to be true. And that's just impossible.
Right. And so I can go with you there, but that kind of God has no relationship to the Abrahamic God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's no direct relationship. If you're saying the ground of being for so-called abstract objects, mathematics, propositional truths, logic, the ground of being for that is, if you can have one ground of being for all of that, and if that's your God, I mean, that's an important factor. But that God is certainly not the normal God that people think about.
Somebody once wrote an article called "The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Anselm." That's my idea in a nutshell. People don't ordinarily think this about God, but when they think about God, they're thinking about the same being who has that ground of being rule.
Okay, well, I want to stick with your definition in order to go through this so-called proof. And so your definition of God is the being, the ground for the truth maker of the abstract objects of mathematics and logic, which we cannot imagine not existing.
Right.
Okay. So if that's your definition, I can cautiously give you assumption number one, that
okay.
If God exists, that as you define God, then that God exists necessarily.
Right. Although I do want to say before we move on, I've got an article in which I give 11 arguments for God's necessity that don't depend on my particular definition of God. So I'm not limited to that. That's just where we happen to go this time.
Okay. All right. I accept the footnote. So premise number two.
Okay. Premise number two is just a principle of modal logic. It's the
modal being
the logic of possibility and necessity.
Okay.
It's the principle that philosophers call the Brouwer axiom. You could state it simply by saying, if possibly necessarily P, then P is true. If it could be the case that necessarily P, then P is true. And that's so abstract that it's very hard to understand.
Well, I mean, let's understand it that way, because if it's possible that P is necessary, and so we like to think of multiple possible worlds. So if there's some world, some whole state of affairs in which P exists, so if P is possible, it has to exist someplace in some possible world, even one. But if then P is necessary, means there's no way it could not exist, and if it's necessary in one possible world, it has to then encompass everything. Is that?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I couldn't add to that, and so I won't.
Okay, so and so that's an interesting trick that you're saying, and so what's embedded in that is it sounds superficially correct to say that if something is it possible that some way that P could have been necessary? Well, it seems like that, but I'm not sure that's a valid point. I mean, I'm not willing to give you any of these premises too easily, because I know if I give you them all, I got to go with the conclusion that I have no choice whatsoever.
Yeah.
So my problem with premise 2 is that I don't agree that it is absolutely the case that we can say that if P is necessary, because P is your God, P could be anything. If anything, if unicorns possibly could exist in one world, then they have to and have a necessary existence, they'd exist every place.
You're right that it's a perfectly general principle, and so anything that is possibly necessary would actually exist.
Okay.
Where I hope I have an out is that just not any just sort of thing could really sensibly be even possibly necessary. Unicorns aren't the sort of thing to be a necessary being.
Okay, so now we're defining as what is conceivable to be a possible necessary being. What kind of things could qualify into that category? And I think that's fair. I might say nothing qualifies. You might say nothing qualifies except God.
Right.
Okay, so we have that disagreement on premise 2. Premise 3.
Okay, premise 3 is the claim that possibly God exists, and this is the one that most people think really sinks the argument. They just think that you can't give a good argument that it's possible that God exists, and so that's why most philosophers would say it's not a proof. Most philosophers are willing to give the theist the idea that, okay, you say that if God existed, he'd be necessary, fine, that's your definition of God, we'll just go with that. And actually, the principle of logic that I mentioned, that particular one, the Brouwer axiom, almost no one doubts that that's the right one for the kind of possibility and necessity that the argument deals in. Where everybody has their doubts is, can you give an argument that possibly God exists? Where I've got some new things to say is that I think I've got a couple of arguments that are genuinely new. Here's the basis of one of them. Many people have thought they experienced God, have said they saw God. Now, I'm not going to suppose that any of them really had a perception of God. I'm not going to say, yeah, Teresa of Avila saw God, and that shows us that God exists. Maybe it's all just a hallucination. Maybe it's something that went wrong in their brains. Even so, nothing going wrong in your brain could make you seem to see a round square. No one has ever reported seeing a round square. No one has ever reported seeing a round square. People have reported seeing God. That seems to me to point to some important difference between God and a round square. And I think the difference is this. You can't even seem to see something that's genuinely impossible. So if you can seem to see God, then it's possible that God exists.
Of course, in dreams, we all see very strange things that don't have any reality in the world. So we see those, so those things are possible by that definition. But by bringing God in, God brings so much baggage that it's such a different character that I'm not sure that argument holds. God is not a logical contradiction like a round square, so that's different. But it has so much different baggage, created the universe and all these other necessity. I mean, it seems like it has a different character to it.
Okay, first, you'd be surprised just what the mystics say they have seen. Some of them say, I saw God sustaining the universe. Now, I don't know what that could be like, but they make the report. And sometimes they say a little more that you can sort of see, yeah, would be a way of describing what they saw. The other thing is you don't need to see everything about a person to know that's who you saw. For example, I might just get a glimpse of your profile, but I know you, and that would be enough to tell me it's you, even if I don't see all of you, and even if I don't see every property you have. If God's got a kind of a marker, if there are things that let you know this got to be God that I'm seeing, you don't have to see all of his properties to know that's what it seemed to you that you've seen.
So what you're saying is that if you can provide external evidence that it is possible that God exists, then you have strengthened the ontological argument, because the first two premises are generally accepted philosophically.
Right.
Is there any other argument other than some people have seen God to strengthen the third premise?
Another sort of argument I'm developing, but this one takes a lot longer to get off the ground, is a sort of a Sorites argument. Sorites is where you add one, you add another. That where how many grains do you have to just take to have a heap? Take away. When do you finally not have a heap anymore? Yeah. It's the argument about adding one. Well, you can imagine a being who knows as much as you do. Fine. Could there be a being who knows one more truth? Fine. Sure. Keep adding, keep adding, keep adding. You never hit a red line, but if you just know you're never going to hit a red line, you're going to get to omniscience eventually. And so if the first thing was possible, and if adding one is possible, and it's always possible to add one more, you get to omniscience in the end. The ontological argument has three premises. One is the logical principle, if possibly necessarily P, then P. I think most philosophers accept that. It's pretty firm. Where you have a difficulty is with the idea that maybe there could be more possible necessary beings than just God. That's perfectly fair. I mean, you'd have to talk about each possible parity you could bring up, and that's just trench warfare. I mean, we could be at that one for a long time. So that's not a slam dunk by any means. Another premise is that if God exists, he exists necessarily. Like I said, would give you a lot of arguments in favor of that. Most philosophers who think about it accept it. Even the atheists, by and large, say, well, if you theists want to mean that by God, fine, you can define it that way. The key premise is it even possible that God exists? Where I want to push is to say, well, if you can seem to see God, that's an indication that he's possible. And if I'm right about that, then we do have some reason to think that there's more force to this argument than many philosophers have been wanting to say.